County America 250 slate of programs this year, so let's jump right on into it. All right, now, as we celebrate the 250 this year, you're going to see a lot of different programs, presentations, and celebrations of our nation's founding. There will often be a focus on our founding fathers, the generals, the well-connected, the change makers of our country, who are well-known and very frequently discussed. I'm sure you have seen many politicians this year talk about, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and all the great, amazing things they did. And while these people are so absolutely important to our country, they're no means able to do this on their own. So I wanted to focus on the little man, the soldier, the private, maybe the colonel. See what they did, how they helped this country become what it is today. So what I'm going to be covering today is we're going to first talk about what defines revolutionary service, as it is deeper than I even initially thought. We'll also be discussing how these soldiers and veterans were compensated, their journeys west after the war to Ohio, and then we're going to ease into talking about our Seneca County soldiers and servicemen, their lives before, in, and after the war, what their families contributed to the area, and the struggles they faced while doing so. Now, what defines service? When I initially started research on this, I was looking specifically at veterans, at the soldiers who fought, who helped shape everything here. That is very shallow thinking, as it turns out. There are multiple descendants organizations for the Revolutionary War. You may be familiar with the Daughters and the Sons of the American Revolution. How they define service goes even farther. You're going to have your typical military service between 1775 and 1783, the defenders of forts and frontier stations as well, and of course, prisoners of war and refugees. However, what doesn't get talked about as much is civil service and patriotic service. Civil service includes people like state officials, county and town officials even, mayors, justices of the peace, sheriffs. For patriotic service, while you could easily think of members of the Boston Tea Party, members of the Continental Congress, you might not think of people who performed overt acts of resistance against the British, signing oaths of loyalty to the continental United States. Even religious officials who turned away the British and instead helped Americans. And of course, doctors and nurses who helped on the battlefield. So, with that being said, let's take a look first at the soldiers of 1776. Now, these were both men and boys who served in the Revolution, with militias and regiments existing in different forms throughout the burgeoning USA. Now, some of these were more formally recorded than others, and many different laws applied to the formation of these different militias. While in Pennsylvania, a lot of fort militias still went by the laws implemented in the 1750s under British rule. In other places like Massachusetts or in Connecticut, they had more recently formed structures for how these militias should be assembled and recorded. So it created a lot of different rules and regulations that were really hard for a lot of people to follow and get their heads around. Now, because of these laws and the unstable state of the U.S. Treasury, compensation for soldiers varied wildly. Now, your typical payment you would see would be monthly pay. These would be payrolls that we sent out to soldiers saying, you spent this amount of much in our service for this month, you get this amount of money. But that was just one way of being paid. There were other things like enlistment bounties. Think of that as like a sign-up bonus, or promissory notes, which were essentially bonds that the government promised to pay these men after the service was over. One of the most interesting ways I could think of being paid was in cattle. A great example would be in Sudbury, Massachusetts. They realized their numbers for their militias were rather low. So they promised 18 spring calves to be purchased that year and taken care of by the government for you, the soldier, to take home after your service was over. You'd be coming home to an entire economic way of life going forward. And then lastly, what I have pictured here is the bounty coat. A rather interesting way of payment. As we can see, we have an order for a bounty coat here for one of our soldiers, Nathan Whitney. Now, a bounty coat was a really great way for the government to pay these men, as not only would they be getting a material good that they could be satisfied with, but having them wear it out on the battlefield was a great way of having all of your soldiers look kind of similar, especially at a time when soldiers' attire varied wildly between regiments. Another way these men could be paid after the war was through land grants. From the late 1700s to the early 1800s, the U.S. was dollar poor but land rich. That means that while our treasury and economy was struggling a little bit, we had too much land to know what to do with, and more than enough people to give it to. Monetary compensation wasn't much of an option, but these men were promised sometimes hundreds of acres of land. In some states even, one could apply for both a federal and a state bounty land warrant. Now, this wasn't necessarily the easiest thing to get, as veterans needed to show both a proof of service and their military discharge, which sometimes could be lost, and there was no real way of getting a new version of one like you would today. Multiple states had land up for grabs, usually in territory that had not been settled yet, or in new western territories acquired through treaties with the indigenous peoples. We've got that here on a map for you to see. So as you can see, in the different states that had colonies already set up, there was land in New York, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, and Georgia. As for territories, there's land in Arkansas, Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and, of course, Ohio. Now, the amount of land a veteran was promised depended on their rank, and, of course, the issuing state. A private could receive around 100 acres of land as compensation, but a major general could get 1,100. Not every veteran who received land would settle on it, though. For some, packing up everything they knew for territories unknown was not worth the reward of untilled land, especially when they weren't sure what land they would be getting. Sometimes a veteran could arrive, let's say here in Ohio, all ready to set up farming on their new acreage and realize, that is a swamp. What do I do now? For others, the fact that territories like Ohio outlawed slavery from the outset was rather unattractive. Unfortunately, some states like Virginia were slave states, so many soldiers from them, they just did not want to sell their slaves and move. Regardless of the reason, men would end up selling their warrants to land speculators, usually for well under market value. Now, let's focus on Ohio. In Ohio here, we had two main military districts. Over on the bottom left there is the Virginia Military District, and on the top right of it is the U.S. Military District. Now, each used a different system for dividing out land to their soldiers. Virginia used the meets and bounds system, and the U.S. Military District went by the rectangular survey, which the rest of Ohio ended up using as well. Now, the rectangular survey, that's using prime meridians and baselines, so you're going to get fairly straight lines and squares often. Virginia didn't like that. Meets and bounds is kind of a really weird system where they use landmarks to survey out land. So you could go on a piece of land, say, what's my area here? And someone would say, you see where that tree is? Mark 50 paces that way. Let's hope that tree stays there. You can see why we didn't adopt it for the rest of Ohio. Now, the first Ohio settlement was Marietta. This was made up of many Revolutionary soldiers and their families, and they traveled down the river by flatboat and keelboat. And then they used those boats to actually set up their homes. The rest of Ohio was sold by Congress at different times, or reserved for different peoples and purposes. For Seneca County, you can see at the top left there, we were part of the Congress lands of 1820 and 1821. Now, that is not to say that no one lived here before then, of course. It's just that they did so illegally, and usually settling around forts. Up here in the middle, next to Seneca County, you can see the firelands. The firelands were reserved for many peoples who had their homes and land burnt by the British, and so this was their compensation by our government as a result. Now, lastly, the most commonly known sort of compensation for our soldiers was through pensions, although it wasn't until the late 1810s that Congress decided to start granting them to soldiers who were aging and infirm. Keep in mind, by this time, a soldier who signed up for the Revolution in their 20s was in their 60s, and there were many who were well older than them as well. So the first pensions were marked out by the Act of 1818, which allowed certain Continental Line soldiers to be eligible for federal pensions. Unfortunately, so many signed up that the government panicked a little bit and said, there are way too many people signing up for pensions. We need to limit this down more. So they did so with the Act of 1820, where pensioners were required to prove that they had financial need for this money, and they also must list all of their property, the monetary amount of said property, and the health of everyone in their household. Now this unfortunately did cut a lot of people out of their pensions then. There was no grandfather system to kind of move the ones who had applied for 1818 in through. They were just cut off entirely until later on, when in 1832, eligibility was lowered to 6 months of service and required oral testimony and witnesses of the veteran's service and character. Now this was very important back then, because in the 1830s, your reputation was as good as you could get. It meant you were trustworthy. It meant people would vouch for you. And that's what a lot of people looked for. Now, these are just the men though. What about their wives? What about their widows? Well, in 1836, finally, Congress said that widows of veterans were allowed to apply for their husband's pension if they could prove that they were married before the war even started. Keep in mind, if these soldiers were around 60 in 1818, how old are they in 1836? Things aren't looking good for these women, unfortunately, and we'll touch more on that later. Now, with that all being said, let's take a look at who we're covering, because many patriots did live here in Seneca County briefly, or they passed through and applied for their pension here. Now, if I tried to include every single one who did that, I think I would be So to keep everything concise and manageable, I did sadly have to focus this on only those soldiers who are buried within our county's limits. So I did have to unfortunately leave out brave men like John Wagoner, Alan Watrous, and Joel Scott. Now, there are most likely men who I have overlooked or missed in my research, as record keeping here in Seneca County during the time that these men were alive was sparse at best. And some patriots undoubtedly died before being able to leave pensions or leave evidence of their service. One great example of this, sadly, is in the great General Gibson's speech in 1842 in, I believe, Melmore, 1843 in Melmore, he referenced a Revolutionary soldier who was in the crowd by the name of Arnold. I do not know who this man was. I have found no record of a man around this age named Arnold living in that area, and maybe I will someday in the future, but sadly, in the records that we have available now, he's not there. Now, with all that being said, here are our Seneca County soldiers and servicemen. We have 22 in total. Now, 21 of these men are soldiers. One of them is a serviceman. That would be Nathaniel Crockett Jr., who was actually a selectman for his village of Thomaston, Maine. A selectman is New England terminology, pretty much a town administrator or a town official, kind of similar to a mayor. And so he worked to help keep his village together during the Revolution, and so he is honored with our soldiers today. Now, we won't have enough time to cover every individual aspect of these brave men, however, I will see what I can do. So, here are where all of our men came from. They ended up settling here, but they came from all over the colonial U.S. Our most populated state in this instance is Pennsylvania, with 7 of our men coming from there, 4 in Maryland, and 3 in Massachusetts. Everything else we have here is about 2s and 1s, which is, seems about right, as the closer you are to Ohio, the more likely you are to set out here in the first place. Now, before the war, prior to the events of 1776, the men who would eventually settle in Seneca County were raised in very different environments to each other. You had some city folks, like Aaron Dean, growing up in established settlements. While by today's standards, we'd call these cities rather small, a couple thousand at best. These were well-established communities with broader resources available to them, sometimes even ports, where they could get easy trade coming in, easy defense systems, with Minutemen and the like. Basically, they had a lot of good things going for them. Now, in our mid-tier here, rural villages and towns, we had some like George Valentine spend their youth in these developing communities of several dozen to a few hundred, often with fewer resources available to them than cities would have, of course. Lastly, for those like William Campbell's family, living in the frontier and sometimes even what was called the wilds, they lived on the edges of society. They claimed and built on land which was rather sparsely settled and sometimes illegal to live on, as it was still considered Indian territory. They mostly stuck to forts and stuff to try and defend themselves from there. Now, fast forwarding a little bit, as these men entered the service, as the revolution broke out, many across the colonies would heed the call. For young men, joining the military was one of the more popular options. Soldiers would sign up for different terms, depending on where and when they enlisted. These would range from a singular month to 3 years, with varying amounts of compensation depending on where you were. Now, this service would range from fort protection to guarding individual towns, and of course, frontline battles. Now, while the big focus is often on those battles, a lot of people don't think about the smaller roles within the military. And some of our Seneca County men found themselves in these jobs, which were just as important as any other soldiers. To start out with, we'll talk about fifers. These were typically young boys or older men who could no longer fight. They provided music that acted both as a morale booster, but also, crucially, as signals on the battlefield. On field battle, it was loud, and a general trying to call out commands to his troops would easily be lost in the chaos. But the shrill sound of a fife could easily be heard, and if you knew what signals you were looking for, you could easily understand. Our man, William Harris, in his first enlistment, as a young boy, I believe around the age of 12 or so, acted as a fifer. Next, teamsters were wagon drivers and supply handlers. They were responsible for transporting and sometimes collecting items for the troops. Now, these would be our men Daniel Groscost and George Valentine. Next, Indian spies were tasked with the defense of forts, especially out in the wilds in the frontier area. They would also be watching for signs of approach or conflict from indigenous tribes, and often they were recruited in because of their ability to learn the languages of the different peoples. Our man William Harris, a fifer in his first enlistment, became an Indian spy in his second. Lastly, factory work, for some of those wounded, older, or those just nearing the end of their enlistment, they would be sent to factories by the government to create clothing and munitions for soldiers. Frederick Hoehn, in the last month of his service, was sent to do just this. Now, let's take a look at our patriots and civil servants, as they are far too often overlooked. These were men and women who sacrificed much in order to ensure that early government and community life could continue forward throughout the war. Nathaniel Crockett was such a civil servant, like I told you earlier, working to help keep his village and even state running during the war. As for patriots, while we don't have any specifically listed through the DAR or SAR for this county, I will say they are individuals who gave what they could to the American cause, whether that be donating goods and supplies, creating munitions, or acting as nurses. One example I do have, though, of a patriot was actually our soldier George Valentine's in-laws. While he was working as a teamster, he went down to Maryland, knocking door to door, looking for those who would give to the military. While doing so, he came across a home with a rather fetching young lady, and he couldn't help but keep his eye on her. It's said that after the war, he came back, courted the young lady, and they were eventually wedded. Now, with all that being said, here are all of our battles and skirmishes that our men took part in. You will see there is quite a few here. We have 17 battles and 5 different skirmishes. From Brandywine to Trenton, from Bunker Hill to Reading, Pennsylvania, both famous and slightly less well known. They were everywhere. Now, sometimes we only know of the service of our soldiers in their battles and forts and everywhere they went, from their pensions and from family records. One would hope that through obituaries we would find out a little bit more about them, but sadly, newspaper obituaries were not yet the most common thing. And for all of our 22 soldiers and servicemen, I have only ever found 2 obituaries that list any sort of details of their service. Moving on to forts, we've got 13 different forts that our men served in. Some of them are more famous than others, of course, including West Point. And interestingly enough, one of them was specifically for a retreat. Fort Lee was being invaded, as was its sister fort across the river. And one of our men who were there marked in his pension that they retreated to Fort Lee to try and build up some defense, but when they saw that the sister fort was already being taken and burned by the British, they left as quick as they could to save their lives. And of course, we can't talk about all this without mentioning the winter camps, the most famous of which we had 2 men in, Valley Forge, but people often only focus on Valley Forge. There were many different winter camps for these soldiers, including some of the more populated places like Wilmington, Delaware, or in Pine Swamp, Connecticut. Where's that? I don't know. But according to the soldier who stayed there for the winter, it was not quite a fun place. Now, of course, these men were also witness to iconic moments of American history, from the crossing of the Delaware to the treason of Benedict Arnold. Men who would call Seneca County home witnessed so many crucial parts of our early history. In fact, I was able to get quotes from their pensions detailing just that. George Valentine, who was there for the crossing of the Delaware and the attack on Trenton, said, "We were taken over the river to Staten Island to attack the Hessians, which we did at a little place called," and unfortunately this is where the ink was blotted. "We took the wounded and some of them, the rest went aboard the shipping and escaped." Joe Bright happened to witness the treason of Benedict Arnold and the hanging of Major Andre, both very famous spies, and said, "Crossed King's Ferry and camped there on the south side at the time of General Arnold's treachery and his command of West Point. Arnold came down and gave orders not to have provisions or wagons pass a short time before Major Andre was taken." Frederick Hoehn, who was on the battlefield at Monmouth, said, "I was on the field at Monmouth battle as one of a supporting column, but not being made, was ordered into a piece of wood, where we lay until the action was over, when we were ordered to advance onto the field, which we did to witness the flight of the English." Very cool, makes me feel like I was there. Now, with all the amazing facts and knowledge of all the battles and the forts and the winter camps and so on, we do need to talk about the hardships they faced during the war. One of the most prevalent issues for many revolutionary soldiers was becoming a prisoner of war. For men captured by the British, outlook was bleak. Whether it was on prison ships or in the gutted factories and churches that the British cleared out for this specific use, being a prisoner of war during the Revolution was often fatal. In fact, a large majority of deaths during the Revolutionary War came not from battlefields, but from being a prisoner of war and from injury and illness. Illness, starvation, and overcrowding grew rampant in these places, as those in prison died, waiting for prisoner exchanges or just to be released. Here on screen, we have a picture of one of the more famous POW buildings. On the left there is the Livingston Sugar House. Now this building used to be a factory pre-revolution, but was cleared out entirely so that men could be crammed into there and sadly treated rather poorly. We have two Seneca County men who were imprisoned in sugar houses in New York City, and they have their testimonials here. Joe Bright was imprisoned in September of 1781 and said in his pension file, in consequence of his confinement in said sugar home, he was taken sick and was very feeble. The clothes were nearly weathered. He became very dirty. His clothes not being washed or cleansed for a considerable time, and he was afflicted with lice. Francis Ditto also had very interesting things to say about the sugar house, being taken there in January of 1780. He said, I was with about 30 others taken prisoner at Newark. We were taken to New York on ice when we were first into the sugar house. Nights we were generally locked in a church, I think a Quaker church. We were prisoners about 3 months. While in the church, we undertook to make our escape. We dug a hole under the wall of the church and under the pavement. I remember 9 weeks with a hog's jawbone. When we had all things ready, waiting for a dark night, a Hessian boy who had previously deserted from the British and joined the Americans, and had been taken prisoner by the British, I suppose to make his peace, discovered to the British our woodchuck hole. Now, while Francis Ditto would not escape the sugar house, he thankfully was released a short time later in a prisoner exchange. Thankfully, both of these men managed to survive to tell the tale, as many others did not. Now, let's take a moment and think about rations and uniforms for these troops, because the Continental Army was short, often, on money and supplies, and this resulted in soldiers sometimes receiving little in the way of food or standardized uniforms. Some men never even received shoes from the military for the entirety of their service. One man who knew this very well was Frederick Hoehn, as he repeatedly mentioned throughout his pension file. Thence we marched, me barefooted, for winter's quarters, attempting to cross the Skyhill, which were mountains in Pennsylvania. On our march, we came to a marsh, and 24 of us who were in the front ordered to fall off our shoes, that they might not make much noise or be filled with water. I would with alacrity have obeyed the order, but not having any shoes on me, I was excused. And as for food, he had to say that we retreated to a mill, drew 1 pound of flour for men, and I kneaded mine in a hat and baked it on a stone. Doesn't sound very appetizing to me, but at least he was able to make bread. Now, as I said earlier, illness and injury was one of the most frequent ways a man could die during the Revolution. Battlefield injuries and illnesses were not uncommon, though treating the suffering soldiers was difficult. Men would need to be moved away from the front or left behind as the army marched on, with the expectation that once they had recovered, they would move on to join the army on their own. We had many men, while looking through pension records, who had suffered some sort of illness or injury during their time in the service. But these three men specifically had more interesting things to say about it. For Francis Ditto, he said, while in the service, a baggage wagon upset, which I, at the lower side, was endeavoring to hold us. I slipped and was severely injured. However, I was soon on duty again, but was always lame. He went on to mention later that he ended up being looked at and realized that a majority of his hip had been pulverized. After the war, he would be crippled for life, and his descendants talked about how he always walked with a heavy limp. For Joe Bright, right after his experience with the sugar house, he was taken sick with camp distemper, which was followed by a dropsy to such a degree that he could not go to his hands to his feet. He continued sick in consequence of his disease for not less than 4 months. And of course, after this time, he was still expected to continue on his service. Nathan Whitney said, I was at Long Island when it was taken, and in New York when it was taken, and situated with the army. 6. In the Pennsylvania regiments, this escalated to the point of full-blown mutiny as soldiers demanded to be discharged from the military. Our man Francis Ditto had something to say about this, as he was in the regiment that mutinied against the government, although he was quick to specify that he never moved against the government. So, by coincidence of this happening, he was allowed an early discharge. He said, about the time before my term expired, there was a revolt among the soldiers because they could not get their discharges when their times were expired. Colonel Stewart was driven out of camp at the point of a bayonet. He did also go on to mention that the entire troop marched down to the nearest city, threatening violence to their officials if they were not given their discharges in a timely manner. Needless to say, they were. Probably for the best. Now that we know about their wartime service, let's take a look at what these men did after, and how they got to Ohio. Now, once these soldiers' terms were up and the war expired, men were typically given rations to live off of on their long trek home. Usually this was about 2 weeks of food or so you can imagine how kind of a grueling journey that was for these men, especially when they couldn't really be anywhere in the continental US to start out their trek home. Most of our men were younger, in their teens and 20s, so returning home meant starting out their lives. Marriage, new homes, and starting a family were the new adventures they had to look forward to. Now, of course, as we've stated before, individual states and the federal government offered land grants to these men, prompting many of them to move to the furthest reaches of their states and beyond. For our Seneca County soldiers, the most popular places for them to go were Western Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, and Maryland, and most of them would move there and claim their land before 1800. Now, they would typically stay here for a few years, setting down roots, starting their families, before moving again to new lands. Now, this wasn't to say that there were no dangers involved with this. Of course there were. Life in these sparsely populated locations wasn't free from danger. Animal attacks, quarrels with the local indigenous tribes, and thieves were common problems on the frontier as Americans began to push west. Add that to a lack of centralized government, it didn't really help matters, especially when there were no real good timetables to set up courts, laws, and systems for upkeeping them. This resulted, of course, in a lot of self-determined justice, people taking it upon themselves to deal with those thieves in the manner they saw best, which could mean really anything. And of course, there was many cases of illegal settling and taking of indigenous land and resources, causing further tension between these tribes and the U.S. Two men who encountered some issues while living on the homestead were Nathaniel Crockett and Francis Ditto. Francis Ditto had quite a lot to say in his pension files, you can imagine. Now, Nathaniel, while living in Thomaston, had this written about him in their history book. Jonathan Crockett, born at Falmouth, who together with his father and brother Nathaniel, had resided a while in the garrison here, having been driven by the Indians from their residence, which we believe on one of the Fox Islands. Francis Ditto, in our Seneca County History and Families book, assembled by our Seneca County Genealogical Society, said, his family said that the story had been told that in preparation for their trip to the Great West, Francis Ditto had disposed of all his real estate and much of his personal property. After paying off his debtors, he realized $700 in gold and silver. On the eve of the family's departure, the neighbors had gathered to send them on their way. While they were assembled, it was reported that a rail fence, located a considerable distance from the barn, was on fire. While the family and guests ran out to extinguish the fire, Francis, armed with a loaded gun, readily apprehended what the fire meant so late at night, and refused to leave the house, saying he wanted to remain to protect his money. And it turned out he was right to do so, and thankfully, because of that, he was able to make his way to Seneca County. Now, while these men had done their time in the Revolutionary War, it didn't mean that new wars weren't going to occur. Sadly, in 1812, as war broke out yet again with the British, most of our veterans were in their 50s or older. Still, a few of our Seneca County men found themselves joining into service for their country yet again. Now, as compensation, there was bounty land available for these soldiers, but due to their age, our men would never receive a pension for their second service like they could eventually for their first. That is because for 1812 veterans, pensions weren't available for them until the 1870s. Yeah. Now, our three men were Grantham Earl. According to family lore, he was taken prisoner on a man-of-war ship, but managed to escape, though with crippling injuries that would affect him for the rest of his life. William Harris shows up once again for his third time enlisting in the U.S. Army. Though he was not able to fight at the front due to his age, he did work making bullets for other soldiers, as apparently, throughout the entirety of his life, he was a rather accomplished gunsmith. And Joe Bright served for 3 months in the New York militia. Funny enough, if I recall correctly, he did serve from Seneca County, New York. Now, as Americans continued to push further west, territory in what became Ohio was taken by our government and opened to settlers. Now, this was due to the Northwest Territory Indian Wars, where treaties were often made and broken. Many veterans of the Revolution were given this land, which they would either settle on or sell. Of those who ended up moving to Ohio with their families, most of them would find themselves moving around the state as more counties developed. Usually, though, they never settled for more than a decade before moving on to new land. Now, also, these men were given land in Ohio specifically because a lot of squatters were actually moving into the land, and the government wanted to prevent them from forming their own colonies. So statehood was on the docket really quickly for us. Now, in the earliest days of Ohio settlement, counties were still being broken off from one another, and their boundaries reshaped. Several of our Seneca County bound men moved into the state before 1815, with 2 coming here before Ohio even achieved statehood. Those 2 would be Robert Carson, who arrived in Jefferson County in 1794, and Jeremiah Williams, who did similarly in Washington County in 1801. After we were granted statehood, Grantham Earl came here to Ross County in 1805. George Valentine came the next year to Fairfield, with Daniel Groscoast in 1809 going to Trumbull, and Frederick Shaughnan doing similarly to George in 1812 in Fairfield County. Now, you will notice on this map here from 1797, we only had about 4 counties. Now, you might think the top there is Wayne County, Ohio. You would be incorrect. That became Michigan. Eventually, it was pushed out and up to the mitten we know today, and of course, everything on top was eventually settled there. But we had those large counties to begin with. Now, a lot of the early settlements of these men are kind of hard to track as a result. I think we all know that Washington County is not that big today. So trying to figure out exactly which county, let's say, George Valentine in early Fairfield settled in, what that would be now, can be a little difficult if we don't know landmarks or early villages. Out of all these men, we do know that Robert Carson specifically settled in what he called Mingo Bottom, which now is known as the village of Mingo Junction, which is still, today, Jefferson County, believe it or not. But for others, that's a little harder to track. 30 years later, and this is what Ohio looked like, we developed rather quickly. Now, at this point, most of the state's counties had begun development, and all of our soldiers and servicemen had made their way to the state. This is also when veterans' pensions began to be filed, giving us a trail to follow of where these men lived and when. Out of all of them, however, we only know of 3 men in the families who decided to come straight to Seneca County. William Harris, who arrived to Fort Seneca here in 1819 or 1820, Elijah Pennington, who arrived to the area in 1826 and settled in what would become Wyandotte County, but also had some land here in Seneca County. And Aaron Dean, who settled down in 1837 in Reedtown. Now, I will mention, of course, that the map is not complete yet. It looks pretty close, but almost. You will see that we don't have Wyandotte County, Van Wert, even Lucas County yet. So there was still some work to be done for Ohio. I will also mention that we did have one man who almost made this list, Nathaniel Crockett Jr. He died here in 1817 and is buried within the county. Unfortunately, though, because we don't really have a record of his travels, we don't know if he arrived here directly from his home or if he settled elsewhere first. Regardless, he was a very early citizen of Seneca County. Now, as we are talking about this, I want to highlight one soldier in particular and show you how he moved. He started out pre-revolution in Sunbury, Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, right here. After the revolution was over, he moved to Tioga Point in Bradford County, right on the border with New York. After that, in 1786, he moved to Cayuga Lake, one of the Finger Lakes, although he didn't say exactly where. After that, he moved nearby to the Genesee River in Livingston County. After that, he went back to Pennsylvania for some reason, to Meadville, getting closer to Ohio there. And lastly, in 1819 or 1820, to Fort Seneca here in Seneca County. Now, unfortunately, in his pension file, he did not specifically state which years he moved about. The only indication he'd given was that 3 years after the Revolution, he moved to Cayuga Lake, and that was about it. We only know when he came to Fort Seneca because of the testimonies of his daughter, who wrote them down in one of the state's history books. Now, by the time that most of our soldiers had moved to the county in the 1820s and 30s, they were advanced in age. While several had intentionally set out to live here on their own without any of their family coming with them, like Nathaniel Crockett Jr., some old soldiers would find themselves in need of familial and monetary aid. These men and their wives would move in with their adult children who had settled in the county, or would find a home of their own nearby. A majority of these families would find themselves living in the country, usually on a farm, helping out their families, tilling the land and such. But a few did live in Tiffin and surrounding towns like Bloomville. Once settled, those who hadn't yet done so would usually apply for their pension. That way they could get some more money to help keep them afloat. That's not to say there weren't problems with acquiring a pension, though. Applying for and receiving one was not easy. In the early US, especially on the frontier, there were few systems of record keeping, and they varied wildly between states. While places like Massachusetts, really most of the coastal colonies, would have some form of keeping of vital statistics, Pennsylvania did not. Pennsylvania, you'd be lucky if your church wrote it down for you, or if you kept it in a family Bible. But who keeps the family Bible if you have 8 children? This is when things get difficult. Because the government would require so much from these men, and they usually only had their word to pull from, they would say, okay, give us your discharge paperwork. Well, for men like Matson Peterson Sr., he said, I do not know whether I received a discharge. Well, not if I did, I lost it. I never supposed revolutionary papers would be of any importance to me. And why would they? These are men in the 1770s and 1780s, some of whom could not read, given a piece of paper that they weren't sure would be valid in a decade, let alone 60 years. Moving across the country even, how are you supposed to do that? So they didn't have it. Sometimes they didn't have proof of service. And for their wives trying to apply for a widow's pension, they needed proof of marriage or proof of their children's birth, when such records were not legally required to have. This, with different lawsuits, and of course changing governmental standards, made things very hard for these men to try and get even little of the money they deserved from the government for all those years of service. With that said, I want to look specifically at one soldier, William Campbell. He had a very interesting journey into acquiring his pension that I'd like to share with you today. Now, he lived in the frontier of Bald Eagle Township in Pennsylvania. He was one of those who lived way out in the wilds with only a fort nearby to help support him. Now, during the big runaway in the summer of 1778, when British allied indigenous tribes would start attacking these colonial outposts, trying to further push them back, make it so it was easier for the British to attack, he fled to Fort Reed. There, he volunteered his service in defense of the fort under Colonel Cookson Long. He was eventually driven from this fort, as was everyone else, as the fort was burned, to Fort Antie's and more forts beyond that, and claimed that he had spent 3 years and 6 months of his life in service of defending these frontier forts. Now, once he was here in Seneca County, on October 4th of 1832, he applied for a pension, but did not receive word from the government of any issues with his application, any acceptance, even a denial. Not until May of 1833. When he finally did, they came back and said, "We have issues with your application. It seems like the fort you mentioned was not real." This is because, sadly, due to his age and memory, he had called the fort Fort Kelly, which was actually the name of one of the prior colonels in charge of the fort and not the fort itself. Now, as to why it took so long, the government claimed an extraordinary press of business caused the delay, though it is to be noted that other applications from Seneca County at this time were processed smoothly and on time. Sadly, William Campbell did die on April 13th of 1833, a month before he received word about his pension. This left his widow, Sarah, destitute, as they had no children here to support her. She put into the paper in that same year 2 different notices of public sale and administrative purposes, trying to sell whatever she could from her and her husband's land and property to try and support herself in her final years. Now, this caught the attention of one Mr. Joshua Seneca Jr., who in May 14th of 1833 sent a very strongly worded letter to the Commissioner of Pensions. Now, who is Joshua? He was a lawyer, a veteran of the War of 1812. He was a former Supreme Court clerk, a leading Ohio lawyer, and most importantly for his connections, a son of a Continental Congressman who had also been a member of the first U.S. Congress representing Maryland, one Joshua Seneca Sr. Now, thankfully, Joshua took interest and wrote his letter, of which I will read now part of it to you. "I will now observe to you that this man died on the 13th of April last, leaving a very destitute widow. Had his application been properly attended to, he could have received the money intended for him by his country, for there can be no manner of doubt he was entitled to it. I must confess, I have been much mortified in this business. I'm the only lawyer almost in the whole of the region of this country, and have been actually persecuted on account of my zeal in his support and devotion to his cause, who supported the re-election of General Jackson. I never, yet, have asked for a favor from this administration. Neither do I intend to do so. But I must ever consider this is a very hard case indeed, that an application on behalf of an old soldier for the relief afforded to him by his country should be withheld." You can see that's a very strongly worded letter for the time. You have to admire his tenacity. Now, after months of back and forth with the pension office, specifically the commissioner there, we did see some results from Joshua, because in November of 1833, a certificate of pension was issued for Mr. Campbell to his wife Sarah, with back pay totaling $164.33. This is notably, it seems, more than he would have gotten usually from the government. So I think Joshua kind of scared them a little bit. And I will say as well, Sarah receiving this pension after her husband had passed was 3 years before widows were even allowed to apply for their husband's pension, if they could prove that they were married before the war ended. Now this would change, this requirement specifically, would change in the 1840s when the government said, okay, we'll push back the marriage date to be before 1800. That'll give you some time. Of course, these women were in their 90s at this point, but still the effort was there, I suppose. We've talked about their lives, we've talked about their service. Let's talk a little bit about their legacy. As they aged, their legacy did live on. Many of these men's descendants moved further west, settling as far as California, but some stayed in Seneca County, putting down roots and flourishing in the community. Others saw their legacy prevail in the homes they'd left behind. Our top example is Holmesville, New York. One of our soldiers, Jedediah Holmes, he and his family had settled in that area, which is now the Hamlet. And the area was, of course, named for his family. Still survives to this day. George Ditto was the son of Francis Ditto. You can see there at the top, there is a painting rendition of him and his cabin. He was actually the first person to settle in the village of Archbold in Ohio. And that painting is from a 164-foot mural that they did to celebrate the history of the village. Hannah Holmes Sherman, the middle picture there, she was the daughter of Jeremiah Holmes, or Jedediah Holmes, I should say, and she is noted for being a centenarian. She was born in 1797 during I believe the second term of George Washington, and she lived until 1898. Rather incredible, she almost made it to her 101st birthday, and at the time, newspapers were writing many articles about her, and politicians were also clamoring to meet her. Though I will say, in these newspaper articles of her meeting these men, she did not hold back on her opinions of them. She got love. Susanna Williams Egbert, daughter of Jeremiah Williams, she and her husband, she's on the bottom there, started the Pleasant Ridge Church, also known at that time as Egbert's Church. And that, of course, is still standing and functioning today. And lastly, Reuben Williams, grandson of Jeremiah Williams, started the Warsaw Times-Union newspaper in Indiana. And we'll circle back to him in a minute here. Now, you may have noticed a few times throughout this presentation today, I have brought up the name Hoehn. Of course, his is a rather famous name in the area, as his son, Rezin Hoehn, became Tiffin's first millionaire. He worked with his brother Lorenzo, whom their father Frederick lived with in his old age, to build up several businesses in the town. Some of these buildings that Rezin lived and worked in are still around today as well-known icons of Seneca County history. At the top here we have the Hoehn Hotel, which is now still home to the Hoehn nursing home community. And we have here the historical marker for the Seneca County Museum, which was Rezin Hoehn's home. Now, we can't talk about these soldiers without talking about the tradition of service that they passed down to their descendants. Now, James Crockett here on the left was the son of Nathaniel Crockett, who served in the War of 1812. And most of these other ones in the middle were also in the war, with Edward C. Holmes being the grandson of Jedediah Holmes. Brigadier General Reuben Williams, who started that newspaper in Indiana, was a well-known general during the Civil War. Private Edwin Crockett was the grandson of Nathaniel Crockett Jr., as was Sergeant Knott Crockett. And then the grandsons of Oliver Robinson, Private Melvin Oliver Robinson and Oliver S. Robinson, both served in the Civil War, although sadly, Oliver S. Robinson would die in battle. Lastly here, we have Lloyd T. Carson, the great-great-grandson of Robert Carson, who served in World War I. Now that we've said all that we have about these men, let's discuss their final resting place. Here on the right, I have every single cemetery that these men are buried in, several of which there are multiple soldiers buried in. Now, you will notice that I do have 2 burial places listed as unknown. That would be for William Campbell and John King. Sadly, we have no record of where they are buried at this time. One additional man who is believed to have an unknown burial place is Francis Ditto. Although through family records and other county records, I believe I've figured out where he's buried, specifically in what's now a field, adjacent to what's now Mohawk Nursery and Greenhouse. So that's pretty cool. I believe that land used to be his family's farm, and as many farmers were, he was buried on where he lived. Lastly, Underhill Cemetery here I have asterisked because Nathan Whitney is believed to be buried there, although I have no concrete evidence of such. But both his wife and several of his children are buried there, so I think it's safe to say he most likely is as well. Now, to wrap up, there is so much more about these men that we couldn't share here with you today. So to learn more about each veteran, I would encourage you to check out our blog, America 250, Revolutionary War Veterans from Seneca County. That is available on our library website and our Facebook page. I started updating that in January of this year, and I do monthly updates with biographies on each soldier, and I will continue to do so until every soldier has been talked about. So it's probably going to be another year's worth of content for you if you'd like to take a look. All of our collected research is available for viewing on those tables in my binders there, as well as some other books on Revolutionary pensioners and soldiers. And they will be placed in our local history section probably around the start of next year, once we have everything finished and assembled for public viewing. Now, I did want to extend a huge thank you to all of my coworkers who helped put everything together and make this possible to present to you today. One in particular, my assistant in the matter, helped transcribe every single pension that these men submitted. And telling you the truth, I was not ready to do so. I don't know how she did it. Handwriting in the 1820s and 30s could be abysmal. So I give her so many kudos for that. But lastly, display cases are set up outside the junior library with one near the adult reading room for you to take a look at how American anniversary celebrations have changed in Seneca County throughout the centuries. And for those near the junior library, it's going to be a map of where these men are buried, as well as a map of their battles, the forts they defended, the winter camps they were stationed at, and other little interesting tidbits. Well, that's about all I have for you today. So thank you for being a patient audience for me as we got through this. Other than that, does anyone have any questions?
I have one. Are these men on the database for America 250 Ohio?
Some of them.
Some of them.
Some of them, not all. Some of them, so when I was initially doing this research, I started looking at the DAR's databases and the SAR's databases, but not all these men are listed there. So I had to pull from many different places to find them, including like the roster for pensions, to see those who applied in Seneca County or lived in Seneca County, as well as looking at individual cemetery records, seeing what men who were buried there lived around the right time period to observe, and then investigating them directly.
Yeah, there's like 7 different cemeteries that I'm familiar with the names, not all the locations, but you know.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
And then Republic, and then Elmar you had, and Pleasant Ridge, yeah, on 101, yeah.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And
you know, pretty spread out as you've selected the soldiers. I find that well done.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, and all those cemeteries will be listed out specifically on the map if you'd like to take a look afterwards. Does anyone else have?
Gentleman talked about he moved like 7 different times before he came to Seneca County.
Yes.
And a lot of them moved multiple times. Was there any kind of reason why they moved so much? I mean, like you said, back then, I mean, you got to go to another place, you got to clear land, and then you're moving something, you got to clear land again, or...
Yeah.
I didn't know if there was any...
Honestly, it's hard to say because they would have had to told us the reason that they were going, and many times they didn't. So I mean, for one soldier in particular, I remember I was looking at him, and he had up in Huron County a large farm that he had cleared out and built a log cabin on of over 100 acres that he tilled and worked on for 12 years about, before some reason settling here for the last few years of his life when he had no children in the area. I don't know why, sadly. It could be many reasons. It could be wanderlust. It could be the family, his children deciding that they wanted to move out to the Ohio lands because they've heard that we have such great land here, and they want to take advantage of that while the prices for acres were still cheap, and deciding, okay, well, I want to be closer to my family. I'll go with them. It could be many reasons.
Okay.
The brothers, or were they brothers that fought in the Civil War, the Robinson and the Crockett's?
They were not brothers.
Cousins.
But they were cousins,
Got it,
yes.
okay.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
The distribution of land, was it given, did the government just assign them, or let's say somebody was from Virginia, and they would say, hey, I want to have a piece in Virginia. Would they have planned that way, or it was whatever was available?
It was very much whatever was available. So at a certain point in time, it was only, let's say you lived in Virginia and you wanted more land in Virginia before Ohio was starting to be settled, then that's what you would get. But after Ohio settlement began, then you had the chance of getting Ohio lands. Anything else? Yes.
Was there a soldier in particular that you liked the story of?
Oh, yes. My favorite by far was Francis Ditto. And of course, as you can see, I mentioned him many times throughout today's presentation. He left an incredibly detailed pension file for me to learn about his life, which I was very happy to do. Not to mention, a lot of his descendants wrote different histories of their family, where they talked about different tales and encounters he had with neighbors, with thieves. One of my favorite that I put on our blog, I believe last month now, was he, while living in Pennsylvania, had encountered an apple thief because he kept all of his apples stored underground with a little hole to get them out of. So one day he noticed that his apples were going missing rather quickly, and he set a trap at the apple hole. And in the morning, he came out and found a man with his arms stuck inside. And the man said, "Please let me go. Just let me go, man. I won't do this anymore." To which Francis responded, apparently in Pennsylvania Dutch, that he had to go tend to his sheep, and he would be back later. He eventually came back, he let the man go, and he said, "Listen, if you need apples, just let me know. I don't want you to go hungry, but I don't want you stealing from me either. And if you do, I have a shotgun." So, needless to say, he's my favorite. He's a very cool guy. All right, is there anything else?